Hey everybody, welcome to The Bottom Line. I'm Michael Noland. You know, the search for the lost ark continues. But when it comes to the search for the Holy Grail, it's over, folks. And of course, I'm talking about the Holy Grail of rock and roll. For over 50 years, Paul McCartney's original Hofner violin bass has been missing. And we're going to be discussing that in tonight's video. All right, so Paul McCartney bought this bass while the Beatles were still in Hamburg, Germany, before they really became the phenom that they would become. Paul McCartney chose this bass, first of all, on its price, second of all, because of the symmetrical outline of the bass. Him being left-handed, buying right-handed guitars, he thought that they made him look awkward. He didn't like the look of it. He loved the symmetricity of this bass. On top of that, its clean lines gave it a classic look. Now, this is the bass that Paul would continue his stint in Germany. He would play hundreds of shows with this bass at the Cavern Club, and when the Beatles finally got into Abbey Road Studios, he used this bass on the first two Beatle albums. Evidently, by that point, he had bought another bass, and I guess he continued to use the newer bass on studio recordings, or at least until he would replace that bass with his Rickenbacker. Now, why is there such a fuss being made over this missing bass? After all, Paul had a backup, probably a couple if you think about it. But the excitement stems from the fact that, first of all, it's a Beatles instrument that was stolen. Anything stolen from the Beatles is going to be in contention as a top-notch draw on the black market. Second of all, it made Paul McCartney feel more comfortable. He loved the lines of it, right? And so just by that very fact, I feel probably Paul became a better bass player. You know, when you just love an axe, you gotta play up to its image. Now, as far as this bass goes, everything wasn't just hunky-dory straight across the line. Paul has mentioned many times in interviews over the years that his Hofner basses weren't really great at staying in tune, requiring constant retuning, especially in the studio. And its bass response wasn't all that hot either. As a matter of fact, he would replace that bass with his Rickenbacker later down the line because it got better bass tones, lower bass tones. As a matter of fact, it was his Rickenbacker plugged into an amp. That amp speaker pushed up yet against another speaker in the studio that had been rewired to become a microphone. Those are those wonderful bass sounds that you hear on Paperback Writer and Rain. But for a touring musician and for his image, nothing quite replaces his Hofner, does it? And on top of that, it's a very light bass compared to some other basses. And when you're doing 100 shows a week, as the Beatles were doing, it seems, a light instrument was a plus on the road. Now, it's interesting. I have read at least a dozen articles on the recovery of this bass. And according to them, it went missing as early as 1963, or possibly 1969 or 1970, one article even citing 1972. Of course, that article also called Paul McCartney's the Beatles' frontman and lead singer on two separate occasions. You know, that's the problem with a lot of the writers on the internet these days. They get the assignment. They're not Beatles fans. They're younger. They have no idea about what Beatle history is about. And what we're getting now is a lot of pomp and circumstance around Paul McCartney, much like the pomp and circumstance that landed our way when John Lennon was tragically murdered. From that point on, a lot of people thanks to a lot of journalists putting the info out there, thought that the Beatles couldn't walk, talk, or chew gum without John Lennon. George Harrison, Paul McCartney were standing around with a plectrum in their hand, and Ringo Starr was picking his nose with a drumstick. So I'm going to take this opportunity to tell you, when the Beatles were together, John Lennon and Paul McCartney were co-equals in every sense of the word, and George Harrison caught up with him before the day was done. Now let's get back to the idea of the Hofner violin bass. It's a beautiful bass, no doubt. Did a whole lot for McCartney and his image, but it's not my favorite Beatle bass. By far, my favorite Beatle bass was the Rickenbacker that Paul chose to record Paperback Writer and, of course, Rain. You see, it had better bass response. That's one of the reasons that he went over to that. And the sounds that he got out of that Rickenbacker were far superior to the sounds he got out of the Hofner. Now, the young man who gave this bass back to Paul McCartney says that he inherited it. They're not saying much more than that. Did he inherit it from the thief? Or did he inherit it from the person who bought it from the thief? Or the person who bought it from the person who bought it from the thief? A lot of mystery is still surrounding that little circumstance, but I am so happy for Paul that he's got this bass back. This is the bass he eyed as a young and still hungry musician with not an ounce of money to spare. And the bass is no doubt iconic. So much so that in recent decades, Paul has gone back to its replacement visually on stage, and I wish he would just go back to that Rickenbacker. Now, when I first saw Paul, he was playing his Rickenbacker. I loved that show. By the time I saw him the next time, he had switched to the violin bass. Of course, by that time, he was including a whole lot more Beatle content at his concerts. The first time I saw him, he did 5 Beatles songs. These days, it seems like most of his content are Beatles songs. Now that leads me to my question for the tribe tonight. What do you guys think about the 2 predominant basses that Paul McCartney used? I know visually everybody loves that damned Hofner, but what about the tones and all of his work from the point of Paperback Writer and Rain onwards? You know, those are some of the tones that people started putting this guy as the number 1, number 2, or 3rd best bass player in rock and roll back in the day. It was the Rickenbacker's work that got him on that list, not the Hofner. Which one would you choose, especially you musicians out there? I think a lot of musicians would tend to love the Rickenbacker over the Hofner, but I have known musicians who love the Hofner. And it doesn't really matter which is your choice. Let me know why you would choose that particular instrument. One being more a visual stimulant for Beatle fans, the other for the audiophile, or at least in my opinion. All right, folks, that's the video for tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give me a thumbs up. That helps with YouTube recognition and all of that. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel as of yet, that's easy. Just hit that subscribe to the tribe button, tap that top bell icon, and you are there. You'll be notified of all of my future videos. All right, folks, I'm Michael Noland. This is the bottom line, but in the comments, we become a tribe. No, we're more than that. We are the tribe.